Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to this discussion on what donors can learn from the rise and fall of the Department for International Development, that's DFID. So I'm Michaela Gavas, I'm the Managing Director of CGD Europe and a Senior Policy Fellow. And so here we are in the UK with a new government raising questions around its direction of travel on development cooperation, its agenda, its strategic approach, its resources, and its institutional model. But these are questions that are also being posed in other countries. So we're going to kick off this discussion by looking back over the last 2 decades to try and draw lessons from the UK's experience of its Department for International Development for other donors or development cooperation providers who are in essence contemplating what it means to be fit for purpose in today's world. Now, this has been meticulously documented in a fascinating book written by my colleagues, Mark Lowcock and Ranil Desanayake, based on over 100 interviews, insider testimonies, and some hilarious snippets as well, and praised by many. So the book is available in hard copy and online on Amazon. Mark and Ranil are joined by our expert panelists. We have Nilima Gulrajani and Stefan Klingenbiel. Nilima is a Principal Research Fellow at ODI, and Stefan is Head of Inter- and Transnational Cooperation at IDOS, the German Institute. Both Nilima and Stefan have a long track record of publishing and shaping strategic and administrative reform of development agencies. So thank you all for joining us for this important discussion. So we're going to kick off with a presentation from Mark and his takeaways and lessons from DFID's history. I'll then turn to the panelists for their insights. And of course, we would welcome your questions as well to our speakers and via Slido. So you'll find the link on the event page, the event webpage, as well as in the YouTube chat. And please do send them through during the discussion and we'll address them in the Q&A section after the panel discussion. So with that, let me hand over to Mark. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Michaela. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So let me just start with a quick bird's eye view for you of what is in this book that Ranil and I have just published. We start with a description of the arrangements that prevailed in the UK for managing the government's contribution to international development between the early 1960s and 1997. And we explain why it was, when Labour was elected here in 97, that the government, in particular Clare Short, the Secretary of State, wanted to create a dedicated department for development. And then we track over the following 23 years, which was the life of the department, both what happened in reducing extreme poverty around the world, which is what DFID was dedicated to doing. That period, as you all know, saw really dramatic reductions in the poverty headcount, increases in incomes, big gains in life expectancy, massive gains in access to education, and so on. And we describe what we judge to be DFID's contribution to that really dramatic, never previously seen scale of improvement in the life experience of hundreds of millions of people around the planet. And spoiler alert, our judgment is that DFID really made a significant contribution. We then describe why it was that the government of Boris Johnson decided to abolish the Department for International Development and to merge it with the UK's diplomatic wing into the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which is what we have now. And we describe the consequences of that merger and the way it was implemented. And in short, if you want the one sentence version of the consequences, then if you read the back cover of the book, which has quotes from people like Bill Gates and Gordon Brown, one of the other quotes you'll see is a quote from Chris Mullin, which describes the merger as a wanton act of vandalism because it destroyed a lot of capability. And then we go on to describe the aftermath, what the Minister for International Development, who was appointed by Rishi Sunak in 2022, and he was the Prime Minister, Andrew Mitchell, tried to do to see what could be rescued from the rubble. And then we give the inside story of what was going on in the Labour Party between 2022 and 2024 as they were trying to work out what, if they won the election, which, as you all know, took place in July this year, they would do. And finally, in the last chapter, we set out what we would like to see now in terms of Britain resuming a respectable role on international development globally. Now, it's not possible in the session we have today to talk about all the lessons that arise for other donors. There's issues around political leadership, there's issues about the role of aid in the development process, there's stuff about aid modalities, about the aid system, multilateral agencies, bilateral NGOs, and so on. We talk a lot in the book about particular role that DFID played on things like health and education, on humanitarian response, on economic growth, on climate, on social protection. We don't have time to go into all of that today. What I would say is, if you are a health expert or an economist and you want to see how in the book we deal with your particular interests, or if you're interested in the role of politicians in these institutions, then if you look through the index, you'll see the bits of the book that particularly might appeal to you. What I am going to do is talk about 4 issues which I think are of generic importance, not just for the UK, but for all development agencies in the period we face now. The first point is about objectives. Certainly in the UK, and I think this was true generally across the development community between the 1960s really and the mid-1990s, there was huge lack of clarity on what the really top objectives were for development agencies. Rich countries in those days tended to have an income maybe about $30,000 a year. Lots of developing countries may have had per capita incomes of 3,000, others just of 300. And aid was spread in a random, chaotic way among all that big group of countries. And objectives were extremely diffuse. Now, when Claire Short came in, one of the things she did was lots of reading. She followed what had been happening in UN conferences. And crucially, she followed the work of the OECD Development Assistance Committee, which published in 1996 a proposal that development assistance henceforth should be focused on dealing with the very extreme poverty. We should be reducing the headcount by half over the following 15 years. We should be seeking dramatic reductions in maternal infant mortality, getting every child into school. And Claire Short decided that those goals should be the single and overriding and determining focus of her department. And moreover, that she would try to persuade other players in the development field, whether it's bilateral donors or the multilaterals or leaders she met in developing countries, that they too should adopt that agenda. And indeed, it was adopted in the Millennium Summit in the UN in 2000. And what that meant was that for a period, there was a very, very clear focus on what the precise objectives of development agencies, certainly in the UK, but in other places too, was. And that was different to what had prevailed in the past. And it's also been very substantially eroded after the last decade or so. One of the reasons for that is a good reason, which has been there's been huge progress in dealing with that extreme poverty problem, but it's not over. 10% of the global population still live lives characterized by that. But there's been a dissipation of effort. And, that is something that countries wanting to support development need to think about now. The Labour government here has said that its vision is of a world free from poverty on a livable planet. And that's a statement which provides absolutely no information on what, as a practical matter, their objectives will be, because it's impossible to imagine anything you could plausibly do with an aid program that doesn't fit within that broad mission. So first lesson from DFID for other donors and the UK in the future, be really clear about what your objectives is and then embed them. Second is about strategies. Now, there's a lot of confusion all the time, particularly in public policy, about the difference between objectives and communication products and strategies. So strategy is best understood as the description of how you are going to achieve your objectives. And the thing about DFID was that it was very, very focused on that question. If these are the objectives, what is it we're going to do that will lead to the achievement of those objectives? And that led to a very clear focus on the countries of effort. DFID focused the bulk of its resources throughout the whole of its life on 18 countries in Africa and South Asia, where that extreme poverty problem was most acute. It worked with agencies and organizations who shared the mission, collaborated with them. It focused a lot of its effort on supporting leaders in developing countries who wanted to achieve those goals as well. And it built a culture which really valued and emphasized those goals. You could go and talk to a filing clerk in DFID or somebody who was not in the front line at all and ask them what they were doing. And they would frequently say to you, what I'm doing here, it's a bit like the guy in famous story in NASA in the early 1960s, what I'm doing is ending world poverty. The NASA guy used to say is I'm putting a man on the moon. Everyone in DFID knew that what we're trying to do is end global poverty. And that was the heart of the strategy. The department was very focused on measuring its contribution and the contribution of its partners, and on choosing things to invest in which would have the highest return on those goals. So strategy is really important. The UK government have hired Minu Shafiq now to help advise them on their future strategy on international development. One of the things she's trying to work out is what precisely the UK can contribute to in the period ahead. Third point that was special and interesting about DFID is about expertise. It had a very high-powered, capable professional cadres, economists, health people, education people. It hired people from around the world, not just British people, and it put into positions of responsibility local staff in the countries in which it worked. And it invested heavily in the professional development of those people and gave them meaningful responsibilities. And that meant that it attracted really high-quality staff. The UK absolutely hemorrhaged that expertise. Hundreds of people simply left in the period after the merger. And one of the things the UK will need to do, and this applies to other organizations as well, is if they want to play a useful role in international development, create an environment where really capable, able, committed people want to come and do their best work. And then the last point I want to make is about the delivery system. And the central point here is that development agencies have to be good at things that foreign ministries do not have to be good at. Foreign ministries need to be good at relationships and short-term crisis management and trade-offs and languages. Development agencies have to be good at different things. And one of the fatal flaws of the merger here is that a lot of the things that the development system in the UK used to be good at, which was delivery, has simply disappeared. And that goes beyond the question of expertise. It's about systems which enable you to turn money into results and outcomes. It's about portfolio management and measurement. When for 6.5 years I was the permanent secretary at DFID, I spent most of my time trying to make sure that once investments were approved, their execution and implementation was really professionally done, so they actually achieved the outcomes and actually improved people's lives in the way envisaged at the outset. So you need to be good at monitoring and evaluation and procurement and contract and grant management, and you need a system and a culture that values all of those things. So I hope you'll find, if you scan through the book, that it's an interesting story of how an institution can play a useful role. It's also a story with lots of human dimensions. There are a lot of very passionate people in DFID, but they didn't always take themselves seriously. And just to give you a tip, a lot of the comedic value of the book that Ranil and I have written is to be found in the footnotes. If you look in the footnotes, for example, you will find the answer to the question, how many DFID advisors does it take to change a light bulb? That was a joke created by people in the department. And there's quite a lot of other entertaining stories that happen through the life of the department that we hope you'll enjoy. Let me leave it there for now, Michaela. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mark. That was a great overview. Just before I open up to the other panelists, Ranil, if I could ask you, I mean, would you be able to pinpoint one thing that essentially marked the beginning of the end of DFID?
Oh. There were little rumblings here and there, and I think a little bit like before an avalanche, you see sort of small drifts of snow moving on the mountain first. But I would say that the first serious thing that I saw that made me think this has got a time limit and it's going to be sooner rather than later was the 2015 age strategy that was published, really led by HMT, the Treasury, rather than the Department for International Development. And Mark talked very eloquently about the importance of clarity of objective. Now, DFID, for its entire life up to this moment, had one North Star: eradicate or dramatically reduce global poverty. And so even though it's a hard task, it's difficult, and on the ground in different countries and different departments, you're not always exactly sure what the exact best tactical thing you need to do in the moment is. Where you can see the North Star, you look up, you see where it is, and you can walk towards that, you can navigate towards that. What the 2015 age strategy did was it introduced 3 other objectives, all good things, sure, but it relegated poverty to the 4th listed out of those 4. And from that moment onwards, that clarity of purpose, that ability to sort of navigate by the night sky was lost to the department. And you can see it from that point, pre-Brexit, pre-Boris Johnson. From that point, I think that's when we start to lose our way a little bit.
Great, thanks, Ranil. Nilima, if I could come to you. So both Mark and Ranil just spoke about this sort of clear articulation of purpose, the importance of clear objectives for which a government is then held accountable. But, we're in a world in which the goals of development cooperation have shifted. They've shifted very much, including for the purposes of addressing global challenges. We're in a world where the national interest has gained prominence and where development budgets are under pressure to align essentially with the national interest. So do you think it's possible to reconcile national interests with development objectives and set those out in a sort of a clear articulation of purpose?
So, I mean, I do think enlightened self-interest can be a very, very powerful rationale. And indeed, I think in the current context, it is probably the only politically feasible rationale to take this argument forward. I mean, when I was reading the book, what I took away from it was how much damage a populist government can actually inflict on such a high-performing department. And so I think it's a cautionary tale for a lot of governments that are facing either elections where one expects more populist governments to come into power, or governments that have just recently had populist governments elected, in terms of how far that fall can be.
And I mean, just again, going back to this sort of dual objective, then, if you like, sort of this sense of, solidarity, a focus on poverty, but then on the other hand, a real focus on the national interest. Can you see them sort of go hand in hand?
I mean, I think they have to be go hand in hand. I mean, our long-term interest as a nation is tied very much to the success in those of others. One only has to look at climate or pandemics, and I think that takes us into the territory of global challenges and global public goods, and the development endeavor can't ignore that. I think what has been happening, though, of late is that those very tight concessional public finance budgets are being eroded by the increasing spend on such global challenges, including crises around the world. And I think, we do need to start thinking about safeguards as well as additional funds, to be quite honest, because the funds we have to date just are not sufficient to tackle those global challenges.
Great, thanks, Nalima. Stefan, can I come to you now? I mean, so let's look a little bit at this sort of tension between short and long-termism. With development being the long-term endeavor, whereas, we think of foreign policy being a bit more short-termist. And essentially the risk that we see unfolding with the disruption and deprioritization of the development agenda relative to other areas, and particularly when there is a crisis. So again, we're seeing long-term considerations of development that are being superseded by more short-term political and foreign policy priorities. Do you see it in the same way? And how do you get the balance right between, being agile and flexible, and then at the same time being long-term in capability?
Yes, thank you, Michaela. And first of all, congratulations to Mark and Ranil for this great book. Really inspiring and a very important point of reference, I think, for international discussions in Germany, but also in other countries. How to reconcile long-term and rather short-term expectations. I think to some extent, what you are asking is related to, let's say, traditional questions in how far development cooperation should serve national interest, hands-on interest, and this kind of rather long-term perspective. I think those questions are still true, very valid, but at the same time, I think what I find very important is the changing context. We have now really this kind of populist environment almost everywhere. Even if populist parties are not ruling, they have a lot of influence on what governments are doing, how parliaments are deciding how the public discourse is happening. And I think just compared to the high time of DFID, I think this is quite different. I mean, there were always critical voices about development cooperation, asking for evidence, is it really successful? But it was very much looking for evidence, for real discourse. And this is very different today, I think, in many countries, also to some extent in Germany. So this is different from this kind of long and short term. It's this kind of populist discourse is to some extent a different one. The other thing is, I think we have today also quite different context in terms of international relations and actors in the global south. So in a way, the way how development cooperation is operating is quite different. So one aspect is, and this is also discussed in the book, contestation of development cooperation by Southern actors, South cooperation, especially what China is doing. So we have immediately this kind of geopolitical dimension when it comes to development cooperation. So geopolitics is not totally new, but the way how geopolitics is dominating nowadays international relations and which role development cooperation can play is quite different. So I think the response we need to provide for the justification of development cooperation nowadays needs to be a different one to the response we might have used 10, 20 years back.
And Stefan, can I just ask you as well? I mean, just thinking about mergers. So with the DFID Foreign Office merger, you know, we've heard from Mark and Ranil that actually it really boiled down to a government at the time that really didn't believe in development, and one that was skeptical of aid. Now, Germany remains the only DAC member with a dedicated development ministry for policy setting. And as you know, there has been a lot of discussion in Germany for a while now about a merger. And in fact, in August this year, Germany's Free Democratic Party proposed merging the country's Federal Ministry for Economic and Development Corporation, BMZ, with its Federal Foreign Office. And they claimed that this would result in enormous gains in efficiency and effectiveness. But what is actually motivating this? And do you see any parallels between the German situation and the DFID case?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for this good question. And this is keeping us busy, I think, to a large extent here in the German discussion. Maybe one general point, which is quite important to understand German discussion. And this is that how government is working in Germany is quite different from, of course, UK, France, United States, other countries, because we do not have this kind of centralized approach. That Downing Street 10 is really providing this kind of clear and dominant guidance to the ministries because of two aspects. First of all, we always have in Germany coalition government. So this means at least two parties, currently three parties, provide leadership to the government. And this is always a compromise, also a bit of implicit competition. The second one is one regulation in our constitution saying that the head of the ministry, or in UK terms it would be department, is really in charge of the portfolio of the ministry. So a bit, this kind of stand-alone approach, you are in charge. So this provides a number of incentives for little coordination, less coordination, maybe compared to other countries. The call for a merger in Germany, including from the Liberal Party, is not new. The Liberal Party did the same already 15 years back, so this is not really new. Some experts rather close to foreign affairs also call for this. I think what is different now is we have all these budget constraints, so this brings a much more pressure on it. But also this kind of questioning the rationale of development cooperation, saying, look, we have countries like India, other countries, now middle-income countries, they can afford many things we can't do in Germany. So is there really a good justification for it? And this kind of populist approach is bringing additional pressure. So what I want to say is, I think the basic arguments are not really new, but the political pressure, maybe to respond to it, is something what is new. Final point, I think many people, when the merger took place in the UK, many people here in Germany were saying, look, even this role model UK, it's now over with DFID for good reasons, etc. But based on evidence, and I think this book is really providing additional evidence, we can really highlight that this is harmful for developmental purposes, but also for the reputation of a country, for soft power. So in this regard, I think it's a very important contribution.
Great, thanks, Stefan. Nalima, what are your takeaways in terms of countries who are contemplating mergers?
Great, thanks. And I just want to echo Stefan's congratulations to the authors, Ronald and Mark, because the book is a fantastic overview of the last 20 plus years of UK development cooperation. And just to underline something that Mark said about how much of this is about the human dimension. So for me, a key takeaway from this book of relevance to others is really just how much leadership played a role. Leadership backed by a clear vision, which was able to drive ambition and a high degree of risk taking, I think, by the UK government under Claire Short. And the statistic that I left with was the fact that in 2009, 2010, 30% of DFID's budget was spent in budget support, roughly 30%, 27%. So that is a inordinately high number, particularly when you think about it being next to zero today. Another lesson, I think, in addition to that human dimension of the leadership, is just how much cultural norms matter. And again, echoing Mark's comments, that the mission of development interest, when intersected with the kind of the diplomatic, career diplomatic interest of representing Her Majesty's government, can result in some real tensions, and working that out is really critical to making any merger a success. I think that the book also highlights the importance of guardrails for the integrity of the development spend, whether that be the International Development Act, a bipartisan standing committee like the IDC, a seat at the cabinet table. And really, if a merger is the route that Germany is thinking about, those guardrails are really critical. And lastly, just how much coherence matters. So the truth is that development will always be a bit on the back foot of the diplomatic mission. And so this argument that a merger can bring about coherence, I think, is potentially overplayed, particularly without those guardrails, because development will inevitably become subordinated to the diplomatic interests. So for me, those are some of the key takeaways. Just to underline also Stefan's point, though, that I think rationale is critical. And I think we are at a moment where we have lost a sense of clarity of purpose around the development endeavor, and that is resulting in some unintended consequences, including an exacerbation of the pressures to merge and to make development serve foreign policy interests. And so I think we are really in dire need of a new rationale, and I'm not sure extreme poverty is the rationale that is going to be the most successful one. And so in that, I would potentially push back a bit on the conclusion of the book. I think it's important. I think it has to be framed in terms of servicing our enlightened self-interest, but I'm not sure we have the political configuration today to allow for it, for such clarity of purpose around poverty reduction.
Thanks, Nalima. Ranil, do you agree?
Well, yes and no. I do agree with Nalima that I think framing it purely as about poverty reduction is not necessarily going to be a political winner. It's not necessarily going to motivate the public support, and it's certainly not the direction that the governments are going in right now, not just in the UK, but across Europe. But I think the kind of things that can generate that kind of support, like really supporting sort of economic development and sort of growth and support of these our partner countries, will result in that poverty reduction. It will not mechanically, not without extra work, but I mean, it's part of what I think is a compelling offer. And one thing that comes up across sort of multiple development partners right now is the importance of partnerships, respectful partnerships, listening to our the partner countries that we work in, and sort of multilateral institutions. In fact, as Mark often points out, the last line of the book is about the importance of such partnerships. If you take such partnerships seriously, then what our partner countries want is sort of strong, stable, fast-growing economies, and those are part of the prerequisite of eradicating poverty. it's not the whole job, but it's part of what it's part of it. So I think I agree with Nalima to the extent that if we want to motivate a real sort of political realignment behind the development mission, extreme poverty on its own might not be able to do it right now. But I think it's at least a big part of what we should be pushing for. I mean, not least just because it matters so much. There are still hundreds of millions of people who live in the worst material deprivation, and in some of the hardest to, not only, but very much also in places which have sort of great strategic interest to the UK as well. So I think there's a framing in which poverty takes a central role, which is possible. But yeah, I don't totally disagree with Nalima there.
Great, thanks, Ronel. Nalima, can I just pick up on a point you made about coherence and the guardrails necessary? So, you know, in a merged model, without, for example, a Secretary of State, how do you ensure that development objectives are not undermined or subordinated to foreign policy interests?
Yeah, so I think, I alluded to some of them. I think, having that Secretary of State at the cabinet table is really helpful to be able to push back when needed. Even better would be if that Secretary of State was on the National Security Council, I think, where increasingly foreign policy gets made. I think scrutiny and openness to scrutiny. So, parliamentary committees like the IDC are also really critical. And I think many other countries should be looking at the UK and the role that the parliamentary committee plays in scrutinizing, and ICAI as well. I think other guardrails, for example, are just the DAC rules. And I know there has been an erosion in those rules of late in terms of the changes to the concessionality measurements and PSI instruments. And to be honest, I understand that, the UK is partly was partly behind some of that erosion. But I think, ensuring that there are global standards for what constitutes concessional public finance and how it should be best spent is also really critical. So those are just a few ideas there.
What are some of those sort of guardrails to ensure there is coherence?
Sorry, was that for me, Michaela?
Sorry, that was for Stefan.
Okay, sorry.
Not an easy task. I think this is an overall question to all governments, including, for example, the German government in the field of development, but also beyond. I think one thing is really you need to have a body of coordination, which is in the German context, it might be a governmental committee at the level of Secretary of States, where you discuss some common interest, how to spend ODA resources, etc. You need to have a parliament which is playing an important role in this regard, just serving as an example how to bring in different perspectives. For the German case, it might be also that Chancellery could play a more coordinating role in this regard. Last point, I think just looking at what the UK what you are missing in terms of soft power reputation, to have a better understanding, if you would give up this kind of independent development model, we would really miss something, how to shape global debates, etc. We can always do better, yes, but just to subordinate it would be to give out of our hands a very important shaping tool. That would be my view.
Great, thanks very much. I'm going to go to some of the questions now that have come in from our viewers. And this is a question for Mark, I'm going to ask you to answer this one. So this is a sort of a two-part question. Firstly, do you think the UK government will bring back DFID? And then if you could also address this question of what you think the government should do next, the new government.
Well, thank you very much. Great conversation. Thank you, Nilima, Stefan in particular, for really insightful observations. Well, there's a debate going on, Michaela, is the short answer. There are quite a lot of people on the Labour backbenches, including chairs of two powerful parliamentary committees, who think that not DFID exactly, but something with the features of DFID ought to be brought back. And the government have commissioned Minouche Shafik to look at that set of issues. And so the Emily Thornberry, who's actually a very powerful Labour backbencher who chairs the Foreign Affairs Committee, has said it's a question of not if, but when. So I think this is one of those topics now where influence and ideas and debate can influence the outcome, which is one of the reasons we wrote our book. But all of you joining in the conversation today can play a part in that as well. On what the government should do next, I'm going to direct you to chapter 14 of the book for the 3,000-word answer on what Ranil and I think. But basically, they need to sort out three things. The first is objectives. And one thing we do know, because we had 18 years of experience of it in the UK between 79 and 97, which is that if you get very mixed objectives, if you want your aid programme to do a bit of development and a bit of foreign policy promotion and a bit of trade promotion, that's a slam dunk. You're going to get big scandals. And we described in the book some of the juiciest and most damaging scandals. So clarify objectives. And the UK will now have to be selective. And I know Minouche is very focused on that. The second thing is resources. If Rachel Reeves has read this book, she'll be cheering in the aisles, because Ranil and I are people who are not recommending an increase in the development budget. We would like the development budget spent much better than it's being spent at the moment. But I think that the question that Alan Hudson has posted on the implications of the UK going to 0.7, particularly in the wake of the financial crisis, is an acute question. And Ranil and I, we're not big fans of the UK having gone to 0.7, particularly because most of the increment, in fact, was sprayed around the rest of government, wasn't spent very well on development goals, because it didn't come to DFID. And then the third thing that does need to be sorted out is capability. Once you've decided some objectives, you've decided the money you want to put into it, the lesson of DFID is you'll achieve a lot if you've got a capable set of organizational arrangements and a good institution, and not very much if you don't. So you better sort that out.
Thanks, Mark. I mean, there's a question that's being asked, which is sort of posted on the chat, but also it comes through about why management didn't fight back.
Well, so let me direct people on that to, in particular, chapter 12, where we describe the sort of process. And in fact, there was a lot of parliamentary opposition to the merger, and there was a lot of opposition on the Conservative backbenches. Of course, in a democracy, the government of the day does get to decide what to do. So what was available to civil servants was to advise, and then up to a point to leave. And what was not available to them was, if they're going to behave in a proper way for civil servants, to be leaking stuff to the press or behaving in unprofessional ways. The reason DFID was abolished was because the Conservative Party was captured by its right wing, and Boris Johnson made a choice. It's as simple as that, and you can read it clearly, particularly in chapter 12 of the book. It's really not more complicated than that. And they were entitled to make that choice. The way they pursued it was reckless and destroyed the UK's reputation. and attracted a lot of very visceral responses from around the world, and the UK hasn't recovered from that. But it was a choice they were entitled to make.
Great, thanks. So let's go on to talk a little bit about point 7, the target, the ODA target, which Mark, you talked about. Nilima, can I ask you, do you think setting a target sort of is perhaps more detrimental to the development agency than not? Sorry, I think you're on mute.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just to say that I may even go further and say I think the ring fence around the development budget around 2010 actually gave the development budget a degree of exceptionality as compared to other areas of public spending. And that exceptionality, that ring fence around the budget, I think drew a lot of attention to both the growth in that budget, the way it was spent, so some of the mistakes that happened in that period. So I think it's not just the target per se, but it is the fact that the target creates this idea that the development space is somehow special, and that draws media scrutiny, it draws political scrutiny to that spend is particularly challenging. And I tend to agree with Ranil and Mark that, you know, good art's law, that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good target, I think is the reality of 0.7. That being said, though, the South looks to that target as a measure of Northern commitment, and in a way, an unmet promise. And so I don't think it's as easy as doing away with that target, but currently that target is no longer fit for purpose. It is not a measure of donor effort. We are gaming that target. You just need to look at how much of that spend is being spent domestically in the UK as opposed to overseas. So the target's not fit for purpose. It sends an important political message, however. And so I think it's about balancing those two dynamics.
Stefan, do you agree?
In a way, I would rather opt to keep up 0.7. I understand there are many perverse incentives related to 0.7. The entire way how to measure it. We know about all these credibility issues when it comes to discussions at the level of OECD in donor refugee costs, all these things. At the same time, it would be quite easy to blame OECD countries not to live up to their commitments. So, and in a way, it's still indicating to some extent the efforts of development cooperation providers. So we need up to look at credibility of the entire system. Yes, that's true. We know about the limits, but to give it up, I think, would be something what would be to some extent stupid, because it would be too easy for many countries just to blame us. And it's also one way, one out of many, how to keep governments, parliaments accountable.
Great, thanks, Stefan. Let's go back to this question of the sort of the end of the beginning of the end of DFID. And can I just ask Mark, to what extent public opinion on aid had an impact on the end of DFID?
Well, roughly to 0%. Actually, what was popular among the public, all the polling confirms this. There's a very, very smart group of academics at Birmingham University who are polling public views on this all the time. What they consistently find is that, firstly, people are supportive of spending aid money on reducing poverty and dealing with disasters and stopping children dying in infancy and women dying in childbirth. That's what people want. Secondly, they find that people are skeptical about the national interest arguments. They think that's basically bogus. They don't believe in it. I think it is the case, and this goes back to one of the questions in the blog, that after the financial crisis, and we say this in the book, people started to wonder whether the UK was right to spend so much of its money, of its government budget in this area. There was, questions about that, but that absolutely did not translate into let's abolish DFID. That there was no public discussion about that. And in fact, to the extent that there was Westminster Village discussion about it, it was let's not do that, because what we'll do is end up spending money worse and destroy our reputation, which exactly is what happened. So what we say in the book is that development is discretionary for governments. It's not like the defence budget or the police budget or the welfare budget, where actually governments have very little room for manoeuvre. Development is discretionary. Politicians can lead, or they can decide not to lead. And the trick of a clever politician is to get the balance right between leading on something and responding. And arguably, the decision that David Cameron made in really 2012 is when the decision was finalised to go to 0.7 in 2013, against the advice of his coalition partner, Nick Clegg. In retrospect, maybe that wasn't the best decision, because it reinforced a lot of focus and attention, which was being generated mostly by the right-wing press, The Spectator, The Daily Telegraph, and so on, and added to some vulnerabilities without doing anything, because all the money was sprayed around other bits of government who couldn't spend it well, without doing anything for the development goals. That's the lesson, I think.
That's great. Thank you. And so we're coming to the end of our session. So if I could ask each of you for a final word, sort of a word of advice, as governments sort of contemplate machinery of government changes, or as they think about what it takes to build a system that is fit for meeting the challenges of the future. One piece of advice. And if we could start with Stefan.
Great, yeah. Let me pick up one aspect which was implicitly part of our discussion, but not explicitly. I think one great thing what DFID achieved in the book is providing great evidence in this regard, to provide a narrative about poverty reduction, about MDGs at that time, aid effectiveness, even the results agenda that was the final phase of. So DFID was always able to be a trendsetter when it comes to the development paradigm, full stop. My second point, looking at international debates, I think development topics in a broader sense, this is really crucial. I mean, just looking at how countries are looking at China's role, development is important. It's about Belt and Road, it's about the Global Development Initiative, etc. And my point here is, we as development policy or development cooperation community were not able over the last couple of years to demonstrate that we have a strong influence or potential in this regard. So what I want to say is, this kind of development paradigm discussion is important, to have a leader in this regard, to have a dedicated institution, organization like DFID, a trendsetter for the international community, is something what is not nice to have, but essential in a very geopolitical context. And this is really something what is missing. That's my final word.
That's great. Thanks, Stefan. Nilima.
Thanks, Michaela. So I think machinery of government questions specifically, I think I already said it, that I think the kind of scrutiny that parliamentarians and other bodies can play over the development spend and the development policy direction is a really helpful aspect of government structure. I think having a seat at the tables where decisions are made is also critical, which has been good to see even prior to this Labour government. I think, though, one important area that's maybe not so much machinery of government is also how a bilateral uses the multilateral system. to achieve its objectives. And I think more thought needs to be paid to the role or to the relative balance between the bilateral and the multilateral spend, and where in the context of the multilateral system there can be greater value achieved for that spend. We do have the IDA replenishment coming up. I think that's a great space where the UK can play a leadership role. We've had the Pact to the Future signed at UNGA last month. There are various commitments that governments, including the UK, have signed on to there. I think thinking through how the multilateral system intersects with the bilateral one is really critical, and hopefully can also take development out of its more politicized context in the bilateral space, and build those alliances that were so critical when Claire Short was in power. So I'd like to see more reflection on that balance between those two channels.
Thanks, Nilima. Can I just ask you, do you think there's an optimal ratio of bilateral to multilateral spend?
I would say it depends by organization. I think you get better value from some than others, not just in terms of quantum. So in the context of IDA, the ability to leverage is often expounded as its main advantage. But I do think it also partly depends on whether the multilateral system is meant to play a complementary role to the bilateral spend or to reinforce bilateral policy direction. So there are various models for that. I think there's roughly, on average, it's a 60 bilateral, 40 multilateral split across the DAC. But that's been going down. And interestingly, in the budget cut context, many countries have cut the multilateral side of that spend, not the bilateral. So I think thinking about the relative comparative advantages of these two streams is really important, but there's no ideal ratio, I'd say.
Great. Thanks. Ranil, over to you. Piece of advice.
I just want to talk maybe my lessons about capability. So capability comes really from three things. It comes from people and attracting good people and having enough good people so that even the people who don't come with all that sort of expertise and experience improve and sort of do better in an organization which has got a sort of agglomeration of great people. It also comes from institutions, by which I mean the structures that govern decision-making and action in the organization. And lastly, it comes from the processes. They're the things that people have to report on and do and put in the public domain, etc., which are given power by those institutions and quality by those people. DFID was an unusually effective government department and an unusually effective development organization, in part because it really focused on getting those three things right. It didn't get everything right with them, but it got a lot right. And I think regardless of your institutional structure, although I certainly think it's easy to get those things right in an independent department, but regardless of the institutional structure, thinking carefully about getting those three things right is going to be really important. And then obviously what you array that capability towards, the purpose that Mark already talked about, is then of critical importance to what the actual welfare impact on the world is.
Great. Thanks, Ranil. And finally, over to you, Mark. And also, if I could just add one last thing as well, which has come in through the chat. Somebody is asking how many DFID advisors it takes to change a light bulb.
Okay. Well, on the first question, it doesn't matter how clear or well chosen your objectives are or how much money you have. If you do not have a system, a capability, an institutional setup, which can turn the money into really great real world outcomes. That's the big takeaway from the DFID experience. That's at the heart of what, certainly in the UK, we really need to get to grips with now. It doesn't take any DFID advisors to change a light bulb. But if you want to know the reason why that's the joke, you need to read the footnotes in the book.
Brilliant. So thank you all very much for this really, really interesting, fascinating conversation. It's been great. There's so much more to talk about, but unfortunately we have come to the end of this session. Please do read the book. As I think Nilima said, it is really a cautionary tale for sort of governments heading in that direction. So Thank you very much once again, and yeah, and let's keep the conversation going.